This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoyed the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. And so I want to give a special thank you to B. Hartley and Reed Ryan, who both just signed up this week to support us on Patreon, and to Rurolution, who just made a one-time contribution to the show via PayPal. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so now let's get to our show.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 420 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Christopher J. Ferguson. He's a professor of psychology at Stetson University, and his articles have appeared in the New York Times, the New York Daily News, and the Houston Chronicle. He's also the author of the mystery novel Suicide Kings, and his short fiction has appeared in magazines such as Aphelion and Danse Macabre. And we'll be speaking with him today about his nonfiction books Moral Combat, Why the War on Violent Video Games is Wrong, which he wrote with Patrick M. Markey, and How Madness Shaped History, an eccentric array of maniacal rulers, raving narcissists, and psychotic visionaries. And now here's our interview with Christopher J. Ferguson. All right, so we're here with Christopher J. Ferguson. Welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me on today. It's a pleasure.
Okay, so before we get to your two nonfiction books, I saw on your website that you also write science fiction. So could you just give us a quick overview of what sort of science fiction you've written?
I try to write science fiction at any rate, so it's up to the reader to decide if it's any good. I'm interested in speculative fiction of all sorts, so I kind of like, dark theme stuff, everything from horror to science fiction. I do a little bit of mystery. I actually have a mystery novel out there called Suicide Kings that's set in 15th century Florence. I like things that kind of explore the dark side of humanity. I think probably my interest in psychology is overlapping with my interest in writing fiction a little bit there. But people can go on my website and read some of the short stories I published for free. Most of them, at least, are for free.
So are there any of those stories in particular you think would be a good introduction to your work?
Oh, they're all wonderful. Which of my children do I love the most? I don't know. I think there was one called Fortunatus that was published a few years ago that is sort of science fiction-y, but it's got a little bit of a darker horror sort of theme to it as well. I think that would probably be a good one for people to start with. It's not too long. And I think it's pretty captivating. I liked it. So hopefully other people will too.
Do any of those, you mentioned that the psychology kind of intersects with the science fiction. Did any of those stories really involve psychology in any direct way?
Well, I think they all do to some extent. My background in psychology has been in forensic psychology as well as doing a lot of sort of media effects stuff. So I've worked with criminals, I've worked with inmates, worked with people in the juvenile justice system. And, I think that has helped perhaps, again, sort of help me see like what the dark side of humanity looks like, but also kind of wrap that into, if you look at people that are in the criminal justice system, they're still people, they have they have good sides, and stuff. And so kind of what interests me is how sometimes people that have good traits, have good sides, can still do dark things or still get themselves involved in dark and unpleasant things, and kind of exploring that side of the human condition.
Yeah. So if you've been writing fiction your whole life, or did you start at a particular time?
Right from kindergarten, I was writing fiction. No, I think I always had an interest in doing something creative. It's always kind of the sense of psychology is kind of like my day job, and that's been everything from wanting to be like the next lead guitarist for Pink Floyd. I'm still waiting for David Gilmour to die. All the way through, writing fiction, or at least writing books. I enjoy writing nonfiction as well. But I don't think I got at all good at it until I was at least in my 30s. So I think if I went back and read stuff that I tried to write, God forbid, in my teens and even in my 20s, I don't think I would be terribly proud of what I tried to do back then. I was also very lazy in my 20s, so I never really. I think that was like a lost decade for me to some extent. So I really didn't get very serious about writing until I was at least in my 30s, and that's when I started having a little bit of success. I haven't built up my Stephen King-like empire yet, but working on it, slow but sure.
Are there any particular authors that had a big impact on you, or that you influenced your work in a significant way?
Yeah, I mean, I think, going back to when I was, a teenager and reading books, I read a lot of horror. So, of course, Stephen King being among them, Peter Straub, Dean Koontz, who's a little bit more pulpy than some of the others. But those were kind of the books I gravitated towards. Maybe some like mystery adventure stuff like by Mark Frost and other individuals. But I generally gravitated towards kind of dark stuff that was also kind of deep, in a way, and it kind of had meaning. Like, it's kind of like, the movie equivalent might be something like Blade Runner, that, kind of has a sort of dark dystopian vision, but also is trying to say a lot about sort of humanity and the human condition and what it means to be human, and all that kind of stuff. Although ironically, I've read some of, Philip K. Dick's stuff and, which Blade Runner is based off of. I don't enjoy his writing, very much, but, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep was really a chaotic book to read, but the movie that was based on a Blade Runner was, absolutely fantastic. So I like movies based on Philip K. Dick novels, but I don't like reading Philip K. Dick novels, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, well, so how about in the book you mentioned that you grew up kind of at the height of arcades and you spent a lot of time in video arcades. Do you have any memories that stand out from that period?
Oh, yeah, that was like back in the 80s. If you were like a nerd, or a geek, that was kind of like the thing you did on Friday night and Saturday. And probably younger people today can't relate to that, but we'd all get our like $20 bills and run down to the arcade and just turn that all into quarters. And feed these machines with quarters, until we ran out, basically. It was just a great, bonding experience between, friends that were interested in that sort of thing. And, it was amazing because you could see like the technology increasing fairly rapidly, across that period. We went from like Space Invaders to Berserk and then to these kind of like, light gun games. And stuff like that. So it was just a great spot, before consoles were widely available. And we had the Atari 2600, but, before like really good consoles were available. It was just a great spot to go and play these like, for the time period with these like ultra modern games and hang out socially. And like pretend we were cool, but we were not. But it sort of seemed cool, at the time. But so it's really like this cultural moment that is totally lost, right? Maybe we don't have things like that anymore. The closest is like Chuck E. Cheese or Dave and Buster's or those sorts of things. But it's just not the same anymore. Yeah,
well, and you said also that you were into Dungeons and Dragons, and I've talked before on the show about how the moral panic around D&D and the moral panic around Doom, which was my favorite game at the time, really shaped my, my adolescence and my outlook and stuff like that. And I was just curious if those moral panics ever affected you directly growing up.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So the Dungeons and Dragons moral panic was in full swing when I was a preteen and teenager. And, all the idea, mostly coming at that point from sort of like the right, the sort of social conservative, Christian conservative movement that, Dungeons and Dragons was going to lead kids into Satanism, of course, but also, suicide and murder, and schizophrenia. I remember the Tom Hanks movie, Mazes and Monsters, came out, in the 80s. It was a good movie, actually, for an 80s movie, but of course was based on an entirely ridiculous premise. But, so people were like, and I remember like my mom would like, see news article or see news shows that would, heighten the sort of panic around Dungeons and Dragons. And these really like earnest TV specials on like 60 Minutes and stuff like that really took this idea of like Dungeons and Dragons and suicide, super, super seriously. And, around the same time, there were issues over video games going back that far too, but also like rock music and then rap music, were in the spotlight, at the same time. So yeah, I kind of remember, and I think maybe more than it seems like to me, at least, that many adults do. I can really remember going through these kind of media moral panics as a preteen and teenager. and, kind of having that observation of what it's like to be a teen, and hearing people say these things about the culture you enjoy that just sound ridiculous. And I think to the extent that I've been able to kind of hold on to those memories, that has sort of made me a bit more alert to when people do it today with new media, new technology, and things like that. And for some reason, it seems difficult for a lot of people to remember back to when they were teenagers and when people used to complain about rock music or Dungeons and Dragons or, whatever the moral panic of the day happened to be, and then apply it to, am I doing the same thing to my kids and the entertainment they enjoy? And in most situations, yeah, the answer is yes. That there's not compelling evidence to suggest that, fictional media has really, any major demonstrative negative effect on people, even if it's sort of naughty. People always are looking for media that looks naughty, in some ways. So, today more the panics are over things like 13 Reasons Why. Of course, we still have the video game stuff. People are concerned about social media, and things like that. And, for the most part, these sort of concerns about modern technology, modern media look a lot like what these moral panics look like, back 30, 40 years ago. Oh, well, and of course they go back through time, through history, but, in my lifetime, 30, 40 years ago. So it's a lot of the same stuff being repeated, over and over again. Much of it comes from sort of the political right. Some of it does come from the political left, as well. But, in general, we'd be suspicious of people that are sort of like saving children, by trying to restrict people's access to fictional media. It usually doesn't work out very well, in the end in terms of how the data looks.
Well, speaking of ridiculous stuff, I had heard, of course, of the Satanic Panic McMartin preschool case, but I didn't realize, this is from the book, I didn't realize this. You say, many of the allegations were decidedly bizarre and included reports of secret tunnels under the preschool that some of the abusers could fly, of orgies held at airports, and even that action star Chuck Norris was one of the abusers.
Yeah.
You would think that people would have been a little more suspicious of that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the things that we see coming out of, moral panics, they're always easy to look back at and almost laugh. Like, it's important to point out with the satanic panics of the late 80s and early 90s that people really got destroyed, by these. You kind of think like, oh, this is ridiculous. Certainly police didn't take this seriously, but they did, and, some people went to jail and really had their lives just shattered, because of some of these accusations that, were made. And it's the same thing. We could kind of look back at, the Dungeons and Dragons panic and, the U.S. Congress had this list of filthy 15 songs, and they included stuff like Prince and Cyndi Lauper. And we kind of look back and go, oh my God, like this is like the girls just want to have fun, musician, so they actually thought this was like ruining society. And at the time, people took it very seriously. Again, these are all like, very earnest concerns that people
we all know that want to have fun is really just code for worship Satan. I mean.
Well, it was their song She-Bop, which actually is a masturbation reference. The whole song is about basically everybody masturbates, which, is probably technically pretty accurate. But, back in the 80s, these people in Congress and Tipper Gore, Al Gore's wife, who was heading this Parents Media Research Council or Resource Council. I forget what the R stands for. But really we're kind of thinking like Cyndi Lauper was going to like send teens running around masturbating in the streets or something like that, and, it's kind of like, kids didn't need Cyndi Lauper to do that, but people again sort of took this kind of thing seriously. This is kind of like this the spun glass theory, what some people refer to it, the idea that kids are made out of spun glass. And if they're exposed to anything, remotely naughty or negative, that's going to like shatter them, and their brains or their psyches or their personalities are going to be irretrievably damaged. And again, it's easy to kind of look back as we kind of get used to technology, as we get used to media, and, we can look back and think that these are kind of stupid, but we do it again anyway. Whatever the new thing that's out, we're now worried about 13 Reasons Why. We're worried about smartphones causing suicide and, similar sorts of things. And these look a lot like, the panics we had back 30, 40 years ago.
Well, it seems like, I mean, a lot of the problem was just that the people, even in Congress, didn't actually play the games. And so they really just had wildly inaccurate ideas of what they were. So, like, you talk about Night Trap, and you say that during the congressional testimony, it was claimed that the player in Night Trap was murdering women, which is not true. You're trying to save the women. And that once you murdered them, they were hung up on meat hooks and their blood was drained into wine bottles, which is just completely made up, which is, it's like an oddly specific thing to have just been completely dreamed up by somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of, concerns about media are also related to sort of what people imagine the stuff stands for as opposed to what it actually does. I mean, you can take like, the Grand Theft Auto series, which is certainly for adults. I mean, it certainly has, content in it that most people probably wouldn't want their 7-year-old, being exposed to. So I don't want to, minimize the content of Grand Theft Auto, but, I've had, parents ask me about it and say that they read online that there's like necrophilia and rape and child sexual abuse in the game. And they're like, think about it for a second. What would the size of the audience be for a game that involved, child sexual abuse? I mean, I'm optimistic to think that it would be pretty small, so this is probably not something that you're going to see in a AAA game, but people kind of read this stuff online and, they haven't played the game. They haven't actually exposed themselves to, the media in question. And it's easy for them to sort of imagine the worst possible things. It's kind of like back in 2008, there was this kind of like panic over, was it Mass Effect? I think it was where it had like the sexual content in it, and people thought it was just like completely. I hope I'm not mangling the wrong game here, but
no, that's right.
Yeah. It was. My memory is terrible. I'm getting old. It was kind of this imagining this was like a fully pornographic game. It was like hardcore pornography in it, and it was on like Fox News, and get a lot of press. And if you actually play the game, which actually took you like 35 hours to get to the scene in question, so it was, in terms of like people trying to get like, pornographic kind of like edge off of this, it was really a lot of investment. But you end up seeing like, a woman's buttocks, and that's basically it, cartoon, sort of graphics version of a woman's backside. And that was the extent of it, So that is a common thing with like a lot of moral panics. It's like the actual sort of concern gets hyped up to an unreasonable degree. And if you actually look at the meeting question, in many cases, it's at least not as bad as what people are claiming. You might still say like, I don't want my kid to listen to AC/DC, or I don't want my kid to play Grand Theft Auto 5. And that's fine, obviously. But that's different from, the idea that my kid's going to run out and commit suicide or start worshiping Satan or shoot police officers or something of that sort because they've been exposed, to this particular medium. So, yeah, I mean, moral panics generally tend to feed off of, lack of familiarity with the media in question. That's why there's oftentimes this very generational sort of element to moral panics. And then also emotion, they tend to be, it's fear, it's fear-based stuff. And that can sometimes make moral panics kind of difficult to challenge, because as human beings, we tend to be more emotional thinkers, and that can make people resistant to information that might challenge their particular emotional perspective on something.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I've always played a lot of violent video games and been a big fan of violent video games, and so I'm pretty skeptical of this idea that they're that terrible. But even so, reading your book, I was surprised at how strong the evidence was that they're actually good or, not harmful. And so this fact that, about 70% of boys today play violent video games and only about 20% of school shooters play violent video games, that just kind of floored me. I was not expecting that.
Yeah, and you can see very similar numbers, even if you kind of control for, shooters who, were far enough back in time that you wouldn't expect, shooters from the 70s. Get rid of them, take them out of the equation. You still see the same basic sort of numbers that are involved. It looks like, if anything, and it's not to say that, playing violent video games is necessarily reducing people's aggression or anything of that sort, but it's such a normative activity at this point that it almost appears like the people who don't engage, or at least the boys in this question, of course lots of girls also enjoy playing action games, but particularly for boys, for boys that are not really engaged in playing video games, or even perhaps more aggressive games, it's so unusual. It may be almost like a little bit of a little red flag, that there's something unusual. And it doesn't mean that every boy that doesn't enjoy Grand Theft Auto has a problem, of course. But it may be that they're, where people play games socially a lot now, that maybe they're having some difficulties with socialization, or maybe they're obsessing over something else. A lot of these individuals who are mass shooters spend a lot of time, with their own diaries and writings and manifestos, for instance. So sometimes, not engaging in a fairly normative activity may be, a little bit of a warning sign. Again, I don't want people to, totally freak out. Like, my kid doesn't enjoy video games, therefore, he's, got mental health problems. No, that's not necessarily the case, but, there does seem to be something to this idea that, at very least, that playing these types of games is such a normative activity. It's so just sort of normal for boys and some girls, to be attracted to highly violent video games and highly violent movies and television, that it doesn't distinguish very well between those who do have problems with aggression versus those that, don't have problems with aggressions. And that's what we're seeing now is from, even in the years since the book was published, that, there have been more studies that have looked at sort of like long-term outcomes, and does playing violent video games early in life predict aggression-related problems later in life? And the answer seems to be no, and part of that is just that the activity itself is so ubiquitous that it's just not unusual at all for, again, particularly boys, but also girls, to be attracted to aggressive games like Grand Theft Auto or Call of Duty or things like that. So it's just not a warning sign that parents need to be attentive to if your 13 or 14-year-old kid wants to play Grand Theft Auto. It doesn't mean you necessarily should let them. But if they're showing an interest in those games, it's perfectly normal for a boy, or a girl of those ages to be interested in those types of games.
One thing that really jumped out at me from the book is you talk about going to the White House and being in this meeting with Joe Biden. And he mentions in passing that youth crime is on an upswing, and you have to kind of raise your hand and sort of tell him, like, that's actually not true. And that really jumped out at me because, like from around 1990, the number of boys playing violent video games has gone basically from 0% to 70%. And youth crime has gone from pretty much an all-time high to pretty much an all-time low. And it's really hard for me to understand how anyone would not really know that, who's involved in politics. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, of course, I'm nervous if he becomes president. I hope he forgets that conversation because I don't want to get audited. But no, seriously. I mean, the impression I got when I was at the meeting is he had gotten that information from other people, and that's kind of what he had indicated. Other people or other groups that he had met with had provided that information to him, and I think that one of the things that I'm trying to think of a delicate way of putting it, but one of the things that I come across is that people that are in certain, like police officers, for instance, but this isn't limited to police officers, that when police officers talk about things about like what causes crime, they oftentimes don't really know what they're talking about. And the general public would think that they should because they're police officers, right? So you'll see example clips of these typically older, police officers talking about, this kid did something wrong and we found that they played Grand Theft Auto. So clearly there's some link there. They don't know what they're talking about, and, and in fairness, I don't mean to pick on police officers because you can say the same thing about a lot of particularly older psychologists and psychiatrists that have made some of the similar types of mistakes. In attribution. There just seems to be something about age, or perhaps more appropriately, lack of familiarity with video games that causes people to make faulty assumptions. But it is something that you do see a lot from, prosecutors, law enforcement officers, is this kind of comment that people are committing crimes younger and younger, and I think that's what, Vice President Biden had heard from somebody. He never said exactly who, it was who had told him this. Now, I've been hearing that statement, in some form or another for as long as I've been alive and paying attention to the news, which probably started somewhere in my mid-teens. So if this is really, we're talking about, 35 years of this message, at least in my lifetime, that I'm aware of. And if it were true, I mean, at this point, kids ought to be popping out of the womb, with a gun in one hand and a cigarette in another. So I think it's that kind of, it's almost like a trope, this sort of idea that, kids today are worse than they were in my generation, which humans are on record as saying for literally 2,500 years. So you can go back to the ancient Athenians. In some of Plato's dialogues, the ancient Athenians were saying exactly the same thing. So for some reason, old people tend to think that the youth of today are much worse than they were in their generation. So I think that Joe Biden had gotten some version of that narrative from somebody, he never said who it was, and repeated it. To his chagrin, I actually had a graph with me that I could hand around that showed exactly the opposite, so in that situation, I actually kind of stopped him and informed him, that he was mistaken, probably one of the most terrifying moments of my life, and happened to have this graph that sort of beautifully demonstrated this sort of massive decline in youth violence that's happened since 1993. So I think, or perhaps I hope that, that was something that was a bit insightful to him and may have reined in him and the Obama administration's, focus on video games in the aftermath of the Sandy Hook shooting in 2012.
Well, right. And it seems like the media coverage has been pretty poor on this because, speaking of the Sandy Hook shooting, you mentioned that Adam Lanza, it was widely reported in the media that he was obsessed with Call of Duty and violent video games like that. And it ultimately turns out that he played almost exclusively Dance Dance Revolution and Super Mario Brothers. But I feel like everyone heard the initial reports and nobody hears the later corrections. And so, that sort of sensationalism or, irresponsible coverage initially is what sets everyone's understanding of the situation.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So it took the investigation about 11 months to wrap up before they released their official investigation report. And in that 11 months, there were all these speculations coming out. So there would be all these sort of anonymous sources that were supposedly close to the investigation. So you'd hear this, a law enforcement officer close to the investigation says that they discovered that Adam Lanza had played, I don't know, I'll make up numbers, but, tens of thousands of hours of online Call of Duty and racked up, thousands of headshots and all these kind of, I don't know what the exact numbers were, but that was kind of like the narrative that came out a lot from this. And nobody knows who these, supposed, anonymous sources were that were supposedly close to the investigation. Because that's not what the investigation ultimately concluded. And in fact, if they a month after they released the official report, they actually did what's called a document dump. So they actually publicly released like literally every piece of paperwork, that had been filled out anywhere in the investigation. So like every single officer's report for every single witness and absolutely everything. It was tens of thousands of pages, I believe. And I did just like a little word, video game, word search through it all. And some of the actual investigating officers, when they would interview the victims' families, they actually would specifically tell the families to stop paying attention to the video game. Actually, I think one officer called it hoax theories, basically. So the actual officers involved in the investigation apparently never were really that concerned about the video games. They were focusing on other stuff, for the most part. But yeah, I mean, the news media just kind of took this narrative and went with these anonymous sources who nobody knows who the heck those anonymous sources were because they're anonymous. And just sort of drilled down on this narrative that ended up being absolutely untrue. And as you say, unfortunately, when the official investigation report came out, it got almost no news attention. So you still sometimes hear people talk about the Sandy Hook shooting, or for that matter, Virginia Tech, which also was not related to video games, as if these were examples of young shooters who were avid gamers, when the investigation reports themselves said that they were not, or at least in the case of the Sandy Hook shooter, if he was an avid gamer, it was for a non-violent video game that he was particularly a fan of.
Right, and so I've been following this a little bit, this issue for years, and so I had heard about these experiments that supposedly demonstrate a link between video games and aggression, where the basic methodology is that they'll have people come in and play a violent video game for 15 minutes and then see how much more basically rude they are. And it sounds like, people will be made 1% to 3% more rude. And turns out, as you say in the book, even that's not true. But even taking all that at face value, it just seems like so obviously meaningless. And I just have to wonder, the people running these experiments, do they not get at some level that these are meaningless experiments that wouldn't prove anything anyway?
Obviously I can't put myself in the heads of other people that, so there certainly are within psychology people that sort of rigorously defend these, analog experiments that happen in the lab. So, for the sake of your listeners, to give you an example, you mentioned rudeness. I mean, really what we kind of do, and I've done some of these studies myself, in fairness, as we have people come in, they play a game, either non-violent or a violent video game, and then we have them do what I would really call like prank level aggression. And we're really talking about like putting spicy, sauce into someone's sandwich when you know that they don't like spice, and that kind of stuff. So it's sort of like April Fool's level aggression, if you will. So it's not, hitting or pushing or screaming at someone or anything of that sort. And these experiments can be interesting, but there's really two problems. One problem is, of course, that many scholars would do these experiments and then start talking about mass shootings, So we went from like hot sauce to, gun violence, very rapidly. And we might say like, hey, it might be sort of interesting to know if people are a little bit more mischievous, after playing a violent video game, but that's different from them, engaging in like gang violence. Or something of that sort. And that largely got lost, I think, in a lot of the way that the earlier violent video game literature was sold to the public. And I really, obviously there were individual researchers who were responsible for that, but quite frankly, even our professional guilds like the American Psychological Association have a lot of culpability in misinforming the public about exactly what was happening, in this field. So there was that, and there was also this issue that, it looks like in a lot of these studies, the researchers really kind of injected their own opinions into the results. And maybe purposely or maybe not purposely, we don't necessarily know. And this is a bigger problem throughout psychology. If some people may have heard of psychology's replication crisis, a lot of old studies are now turning out to be not true. But what was happening is there really wasn't adequate standardization. There really wasn't adequate like transparency and controls in a lot of psychological research. So you would have psychological researchers in this field and in other fields, run their statistics and then rerun their statistics and then rerun their statistics in multiple different ways until they would get the results that they wanted. So as a consequence of that, a lot of the results were simply false. They were what the experimenter wanted to see, not what was actually happening with the participants in the study. Now, there are ways of fixing that. There's something called pre-registration, where scholars can publish their plans for collecting and analyzing data in advance so they can't monkey with it once they got their data. And if we look at pre-register studies in this field, I think there's maybe 10 to 12, not very many, pre-register studies. Really, none of them find, evidence for violent video game effects. I think maybe one of them found some inconsistencies. The rest all were pretty clearly null studies. So if you look at sort of like the more standardized, more transparent, better done studies, pretty much none of them have found any evidence so far, at least, for there being a relationship between violent video game playing and aggressiveness.
Yeah, so I really found your book pretty persuasive and just overwhelming in terms of disproving that hypothesis. What sort of did you get pushback on the book at all from people who continue to defend this video games cause real world violence idea?
Not too much on the book itself. I will say it is. One of the ironies of aggression research is just how aggressive aggression researchers are, right? In general. So there certainly is pushback, but I think, a lot of the pushback predated the books, so some of that, was already going on, and I'll be frank. I mean, some of it was and has been quite nasty. They're very personal in some situations. And again, it's sort of weird to see that, one about a field that maybe isn't, it's not like cancer research, right? I mean, it's not like maybe like super, super important, but also ironically of a field that at least ostensibly is concerned about aggression. You know what I mean? So you would think that, maybe aggression researchers would mirror, collegiality if they really were concerned about aggression, but unfortunately they really don't.
Well, maybe aggression research is the leading cause of mass shootings.
It could be. I mean, sometimes I think some of it's kind of joke that, we're not aggressive because we play a lot of violent video games. We're aggressive because we do a lot of violent video game research and have to interact with other video game violence researchers. And so it's really people that make us aggressive, not technology. And it's probably something to be, said for that. The world would be a lot more peaceful if it weren't for all the people that were in it, ruining it. But I think other than that, the other thing it's been kind of difficult is, we have some professional organizations, like I said, the professional guilds, like the American Psychological Association, that unfortunately in the early days went way out on a limb, in terms of their reputations, linking video games to aggressiveness and violence in society and things like that. And it's been a slow process to get them to walk back, what I think are pretty misinformative public statements that these organizations have made. I mean, to their credit, the American Psychological Association has more recently been clear in saying that violent video games are not linked to actual violent crimes. But they're trying to sort of hold on the line with, milder aggression, which they don't define. Which I think still confuses a lot of people, particularly given that the evidence isn't really there for mild aggression any more than it is for violent crime. So, but I think that's also because, again, what people have to understand is that organizations like the American Psychological Association are not science organizations; they're professional guilds. They're really marketing agencies, for psychology. And in fairness, I'll say I'm a fellow of the American Psychological Association, so I have my own involvement with them, even though I'm oftentimes very critical of them. So they basically are there to defend psychology, not tell you the truth, in essence. And I think that's may help the public understand why professional guilds like the American Psychological Association or American Psychiatric Association or American Medical Association sometimes get caught, in these situations where they seem to either be confused or are saying things that appear to be patently untrue. And I think that's really kind of like the next challenge, for us in this field is to help organizations like the American Psychological Association walk back some of their public statements that are not correct and are misinforming the public rather than helping them.
One line in the book is you say, the old adage, fear sells, is true. Fear sells books, parentheses. We'll see how this one does since we're basically telling you everything is okay. And I was just curious how that played out. Did the book sell well, and did it sell well compared to more sort of fear-mongering kinds of media?
Oh, yeah. I write books altogether the wrong way. I mean, the book is done okay, but, it certainly... There definitely is this. I mean, I have not bought my first Ferrari yet or anything off of, the proceeds of the book. So it's a, I'm always happy when anybody's read it, like I said, I have not yet built up an empire like Stephen King or Steven Pinker or anybody like that, so. Yeah, there definitely is this kind of truism that you will sell books better by scaring the crap out of people or making young people look bad. That's another thing that seems to sell, books about how terrible youth today are one way or another. These are the kind of things that tend to sell better, saying that everything's basically okay. Messages of optimism don't sell, for the most part, a book that basically says video games don't really do a lot. They don't make you aggressive. They don't increase your IQ. They don't cause cancer, is a hard sell. Today. And it's the same thing if you kind of say, like, kids today are basically okay. They've got some challenges, but they're less violent. They use drugs less, they smoke less, is a lot harder to sell to the public than, here's why your kid is on the edge of doom, and what you need to know, that kind of thing sells books, a lot better. And that probably says something about human nature, right? We seem to be attracted to, darker, negative messages to a greater degree. And every so often you hear people talk about news media the same way. Like, why doesn't the news ever report the good stuff that's happening in the world? And it's simple. Nobody watches it. This is a very clear answer there. If people watched it, then that's what the news would do. But unfortunately, news media, like fictional media, have to, gravitate towards, what is salacious, what is gory, so fear sells, blood sells, negativity sells, and, that's always been the case, and it doesn't look like that's going to change anytime soon, I'm afraid.
Well, I mean, like I was saying, like growing up, experiencing these moral panics as a teenager, I think made me highly sensitized to not repeating that myself. But I have to admit, I do find myself feeling like the kids these days have gone horribly wrong. So I'd like to run a few things by you, and maybe you can talk me down from this.
Yeah.
But I do really worry about the impacts of social media and just sort of internet culture in general. And I feel like, when I was growing up with no internet, I was reading all these books and watching all these TV shows and reading magazines and so on. And a lot of it was total crap. But at least it was about people who weren't me, which made me have to think about people besides myself. Whereas I feel like so many young people now are just on social media all day and just posting their own thoughts and posting pictures about themselves and what they're doing, and only interacting or largely interacting with people in their peer group. And it's just sort of breeding this kind of narcissism that is unique to the era of smartphones and social media.
Yeah, well, there's good news and bad news when it comes to social media. So, the good news, and this is a fairly new area of research, so there certainly is debate, so again, you'll see like the headlines that are like social media is like heroin, or social media is causing girls to commit suicide and this kind of stuff. So there certainly are scholars that are debating this back and forth. I mean, my read of the evidence is that if we're talking about things like social media changing people's mental health by mere exposure, I don't think the evidence there is much better than it was for video games or television or books or anything of that sort. So simply being on Facebook or God forbid Twitter, the time spent in and of itself doesn't seem to be rotting kids' brains, or things like that. There's really no evidence, that, kids today are in most ways are worse off than they were in the past. Teenage suicide rates have risen, for girls in particular, but that's true for all age categories. So it's nothing unique to teenagers. In fact, the suicide rates are highest among middle-aged adults, and actually the increase in suicide is highest among middle-aged adults. So there seems to be something kind of systematically happening in American society that's increasing suicide, not something specific to teenagers, which suggests that it's probably not social media in and of itself, at least, that is doing it. So that's the good news I don't think there's this kind of like mere exposure effect. Simply being on social media is causing harm. However, I mean, I do think social media does bring with it some challenges. I mean, and one practical one is, of course, all the privacy concerns that people have around social media. But more than that, I mean, one thing, as I kind of made the joke earlier, and maybe it's not really a joke, is a sort of sense of like what does kind of make us have issues as other human beings, right? It's really other people that sort of screw us up. And with social media, you can come into contact with a much wider group of people who have no investment in you whatsoever, right? And so that's where I think there's a lot of talk about how cruel social media can be. It's not the technology, it's the people that's on it. We can talk about things like cancel culture and bullying, cyberbullying, and all kinds of other stuff that happen in these spaces. And social media is also kind of dangerous in the sense that, particularly with teenagers who may post things that are stupid, that are offensive or whatever, those things can haunt them, for the rest of their lives, in some situations. And we know that, teenagers say stupid stuff. Teenagers do stupid stuff. I mean, a lot of adults do as well, right? But, we usually give teenagers a sort of a pass. They're still maturing. They're developing empathy. They're trying to figure out the rules, but they now can post things on social media that 30 or 40 years ago, if they had said the same thing to their friends, their friends might have talked back to them or something of that sort. It wouldn't have been a big deal. Now it's in cyberspace forever. It can, haunt them eternally. And so there are some new dangers that come with social media, particularly to the extent that it has evolved to be the sort of uncompromising, cruel kind of bullying space. That's why I kind of made this reference to, God forbid, Twitter. I think Twitter is kind of particularly known, for that sort of thing. And there also seems to be this sense of like hyperpolarization that occurs in social media spaces, so to the extent that, for instance, we seem to be experiencing greater polarization in our society more broadly, I don't think all of that, or even the majority of that, is necessarily due to social media, but I don't think social media is necessarily helping, either. And so you can get, go ahead.
Well, it's just this thing that I feel like I see this sort of sanctimonious certitude shading over very quickly into violent rhetoric. Like, I don't remember when I was a teenager anyone ever saying, I'm going to just punch someone if I disagree with their political views, or I feel like that's ubiquitous now.
It is common. Yeah, I think you're right, about that. So I think, again, this is sort of like the negative side, of social media, is that in some ways it's, there was this idea when social media really started developing. I'm really talking about like forums and like discussion groups and that kind of stuff that really started popping out even in the late 90s, before Facebook, before Twitter. So there was this kind of the sense of, right, like social media is going to be, or the internet more broadly, is going to be this kind of like communal space, right? It's going to be more democratic. People are going to exchange more views. It's going to result in bringing people closer together. And, there's an element of truth to that, but we can see also that it didn't always work out that way. And in some respects, social media has allowed us to become more siloed, to really not engage with ideas that are different from our own, or to the extent that we do, it is this sort of sense of like, this person disagrees with my worldview, so why hasn't someone kicked in their teeth yet? In fact, that actually is a quote, that has gotten some news attention recently. And that came from an adult, by the way, not a teenager. So there is this sort of sense of, I won't say that people didn't ever use violent rhetoric in interpersonally before social media. They did. There were people always would say, I'm going to kill you, because they got angry with each other or whatever. But it's now almost like a entertainment for one's like cultural group, right? So it's almost like, there's this idea that people are more aggressive online when they're anonymous, and there's some evidence that suggests that's true, but in some spaces some evidence to suggest that in some spaces people actually become more aggressive when they're not anonymous, meaning that they're actually using their aggression towards an out-group to signal their involvement or their allegiance with an in-group, and that's why you'll sometimes see, like, particularly, putting it kind of simply here, that people on the right may engage in violent rhetoric towards people on the left, but people on the left engage in violent rhetoric towards people on the right. Or it may not even be that far apart. Sometimes people that are even slightly different in their opinions may engage in this kind of violent rhetoric towards each other. So there has been this kind of element on social media where sort of like the norms of civility have broken down, to some degree. And also this kind of sense that there's no due process, to any of this. And if someone says the wrong thing, that their life must be destroyed, is another element that seems to have come out of, some of the social media, exchanges. It's almost like, societal death sentence. People kind of like declare on each other because they have divergences or views, or someone actually does something that's offensive, but it's a one-off. But it offended people enough that, they have no graciousness or forgiveness for the person. And that's, I think, something that is contributing. It's not, I think, the only thing, but something that is contributing to the difficulties we're having right now, finding unity, finding compromise, finding some degree of shared purpose in our culture.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing I was going to mention is I feel like there used to be a pretty clear delineation between mainstream media culture, which was more or less based around facts, and then internet culture, which is like everyone's calling each other Hitler and spreading conspiracy theories. And I feel like the people who are like my age and younger who grew up on the internet have sort of like grown up thinking it's just normal to call anyone you disagree with Hitler. And now they're starting to get jobs at actual mainstream media publications and just bringing that, that culture with them. And so it's making everything seem like the internet,
Yeah. Well, I know, in the last few months, I've kind of mused over, we're coming towards a voting cycle here, and, who knows what will happen in November, but I sometimes think about, who are, the winners and losers of the Trump administration, and I don't know if there are any winners, but one of the, I think, groups that, to my surprise, I think to some extent is going to come out having difficulties is journalism. That I think, a lot of what you said is exactly correct. That back in 2016, Trump kind of talked about, fake news and main or lamestream media. And I think for the most part, most people kind of thought that was him being hyperbolic, as he always is. And, being kind of full of nonsense. And I, there's a saying, or at least I've said this. I don't know if anybody else has said this, but, if someone accuses you of something ridiculous, you should try not to give them evidence to support the ridiculous accusation that they're making about you. And I think, unfortunately, news media, on both sides, Fox News is obviously as guilty as this as, say the Washington Post or New York Times are. But there has been this sort of sense that news media has decided to pick sides, and the news now reflects a particular worldview, so everything is kind of filtered through a particular worldview, and you can pick which one you like. So if you really want this kind of far left, I can't even believe I'm describing the New York Times as being far left, but it seems to be where they're going. And so this far left narrative, you can select the New York Times or something like that. If you want the far right narrative, of course, you can select Fox News. Neither are true, necessarily, and that really, I think, is going to confuse most people who, there's this term I've seen bandied about recently, the sort of exhausted majority, if you will, but for most people that aren't really on either pole, they're going to come out of this, I think, not knowing what to trust when it comes to, to news media. And I don't know how news media is going to put that genie back in the bottle. I don't know how they restore, credibility, going forward, from this. And that's been a really rapid change, I think, over particularly the last 4 years.
So I feel like you're pretty much agreeing with me rather than making the case that the kids are all right.
Well, I don't think it's all the kids, necessarily, but, a lot of this has been, I think, in the works for some time, so, it's always easy to kind of blame, the current situation on the youth of today. And there may be something to this. Of course, Jonathan Haidt has kind of made this point for a while that, universities and academia have been responsible for perhaps not acculturating youth in the sense of critical thinking and sort of civics, and free speech and things like that. And now, as you kind of indicated, as some of these individuals have graduated, they're taking their value system that doesn't involve things like free speech or due process or whatever else into their careers. So I think there's something to that, but we, in fairness to those graduates, in fairness to those kids today, they were taught by older people, so some of this, I think, is a process that has been going on, easily for a decade or so. And I think that the origins of it stretch back even further, than that. So, I think, yes, we do see these generational changes in values. Younger people in general tend to be more liberal than older people. There tends to be a little bit of a shift over the lifespan. But I think that, some of these things that we're seeing, in society today, in journalism and academia, have been in the works for some time and really kind of reflect this hyperpolarization that I think really can be traced back in some degree, at least to the 90s, if not further back even than that.
I also wanted to ask you, in the book, How Madness Shaped History, you say that you're talking about Steve Jobs, and you say his personality style evokes elements of several personality disorders such as narcissistic, schizotypal, and obsessive-compulsive without fitting comfortably into any of them. So do we need a Steve Jobs personality disorder?
Yeah, I think there's this kind of, yeah, sure. I love to get a diagnosis in the DSM. Yeah, I mean, the reality is, of course, any kind of classification system for mental disorders is never going to be perfect. We like to think in terms of categories, but people don't tend to fit into categories, very well is, the reality of it. It's just these systems make it easier for us to converse, to some extent. But, yeah, I mean, there does seem to be this sort of personality style that is just like visionary, style that you can see in perhaps like Steve Jobs or, Bezos or Elon Musk or that kind of thing, hyperactive, not in an ADHD sense, but more like this full of energy, full of vision, have big ideas, a little bit of narcissism, maybe a lot of narcissism, some obsessive compulsiveness, maybe a little bit strange. So schizotypal personality disorder just basically suggests the person has some unusual beliefs, unusual ways of behaving, and that sort of stuff. And with some of these cases like Steve Jobs, it can, when it works, it can be brilliant. So Steve Jobs was absolutely, a visionary. He was fascinating. But of course, the reality is that most individuals with that personality style crash and burn. We only really pay attention to the ones that are amazingly successful. We don't always see the visionaries who came up with silly ideas. Or just burned out, one way or another. I mean, another example, I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but it was the woman who developed, or claimed to have developed a blood test.
Elizabeth Holmes.
Yes, thank you. Who kind of would fit into that category as well. And of course, she crashed and burned because she actually never really did develop, a working, blood test as she had claimed. So I think probably more people with that personality style fit into the Elizabeth Holmes sort of, outcome. Maybe not quite as bad as that. And fewer of them really fit into the Steve Jobs or Jeff Bezos, categories. But yeah, I mean, there is a sort of a distinct style. I mean, I don't know a lot about Elon Musk. I admire him because he came up with a flamethrower that I could buy someday. so desire to. And I think that's pretty cool. So I don't know much about his personality, but I just sort of think about the way he lives. And I'm like, oh my God, I would be so tired. I need an afternoon nap, every day. And I would just never be able to live the life that he does. And that's not a knock against him. That's not a criticism of him. If anything, it's a criticism of me. But it takes a special kind of personality, a special kind of person to live that kind of life. And when they're successful, they can be amazingly successful. And when they're not successful, they can be amazingly not successful. So we have to keep that in mind sometimes while we sort of glorify that particular personality style.
Well, I read the biography of Elon Musk, and I think it's a similar sort of thing to Steve Jobs, where he's, he's really acting like a jerk. He's pushing people past their limits, and he's sort of betraying people who have shown him nothing but loyalty, and constantly making unreasonable demands. But then you see, as you read the book, that if he were nicer, he wouldn't accomplish anything, right? And
Correct.
So it's kind of a weird thing where it's like, we don't want people to have personality disorders. We don't want them to mistreat other people. But there's just certain situations where you need someone to be a jerk, it seems, to accomplish great things. And if we sort of weed that out of the population in whatever way, are we losing a lot of potential that we might otherwise have?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's this kind of idea if you talk about, psychopathy, for instance. And by the way, I'm not saying that, Elon Musk is a psychopath. But if you kind of look at antisocial personality disorder, which is the same thing as psychopathy, that, certainly some of these individuals become criminals, and that's bad. We don't want that. But others of them find places in society where they fit very well. And actually we kind of want them. In those roles. And, I've done some work, for instance, with, military veterans and to be very, very clear, the vast majority of military veterans are not psychopaths. I worked with some who, were voluntary frontline combat troops. They actually volunteered, to go into combat. And some of these soldiers would talk about that they enjoyed it. That it was a thrill. It was an adrenaline rush. They liked it. It was actually kind of hard for them to fit back into society because it was dull. I respect that to some extent. I mean, in the sense that those are the guys or women that we want in frontline combat. So you don't want me. I'm going to be hiding behind a rock the whole time. You want these people that are able to function very well in those roles, and these aren't bad people. They're patriotic. They want to do something for their country. It's just that they fit well in this particular role that most of us, would not. Would you want this person to be your social worker? Probably not. Do you want them in a role where they can use their unique traits to benefit our society? Absolutely. So, and I think that's the same sort of thing that if you look at, certain types of career paths, most of us just are not going to fit into those things. We'd be miserable. I would probably be miserable with Elon Musk's life. He looks like he's having a lot of fun. So he shot a car into space. That is kind of cool. So I respect that. I wouldn't want to live his life, but I respect that he is doing what he's doing and is doing that successfully. It would be nice if he didn't, pick on people or bully them. That sort of stuff. But sometimes it is perhaps difficult to separate the negative from the positive. And that really can be kind of a challenge. I mean, Steve Jobs was the same way, that he mistreated a lot of people in the course of his life, but he also really revolutionized multiple technology industries. And, is that a net gain or a net loss for society? I think that, is something that is hard to answer. It's a bit subjective.
What is sort of the current state of people blaming video games for things? Should gamers kind of feel like they've won the war, or are there things that we still need to be manning the barricades on?
I think things are better. So you're looking over the last 15 years, definitely things are different than they were in 2005. I think 2005 was about the height of video game blaming, if you will, and things have slowly gotten better since then. I think people are tired of it. Well, and of course, there's also this issue with moral panics moral panics, of course, cater to an audience, and then eventually that audience dies, right? And that's what really makes it more. That's why nobody thinks about like Ozzy Osbourne anymore. Nobody cares about Ozzy Osbourne causing suicide, although he was sued, for exactly that back in the early 90s, if I remember correctly. But now we're worried about 13 Reasons Why, so same kind of thing, repeated. But that's what kind of happens is the audience will basically die. So I think with the video game violence / mass shooting thing, one thing that seems to have happened is for some reason or another, it seems to have become almost entirely a right-wing issue. So in the last couple of cases, like the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting in 2017, if I remember correctly. I might have the year off there. But the President Trump raised this issue of video games, and then everybody on the left, kind of fell into the other boat, which I think says a lot about modern politics today. But, so if for whatever reason, the right wing of politics seems to have made it their issue, which turned it off to half the population. So I think we've at least got half the population doesn't worry about this anymore. It may still come up with shootings that are perpetrated by young males, I think with less and less energy each time. I don't want to be too Pollyannish about it and say that we'll never hear from it again. I think we'll probably still occasionally hear people talk about violence in video games, but I think that the enthusiasm behind it has definitely declined significantly. I think now people are moving over to other things, certainly the social media, smartphones, but also, that still is more coming from conservatives, with the left, and particularly with the last few weeks, I've seen some similar stuff about, like cop-themed shows, all the way up to including Paw Patrol, which is kind of interesting, so I'm not making that up, so we may see people, sort of identify fictional media of one sort or another that appears to oppose a particular moral agenda. And I think we'll just continue seeing that cycle that, people will pick up on new things that they worry about that will get some energy for a little while. Hopefully some research, hopefully some pre-registered research will come out that will sort of examine these issues. And then we'll see what the data says. It's always possible. Maybe one of these things really does have some sort of negative effect. I don't want to rule that out as a possibility. So far, these kind of moral panics have batted pretty much zero. So the likelihood is in most of these cases, it won't turn out to be at least as big a deal as people were worried about. But yeah, that seems to be kind of the cycle, is that, we can look back at past moral panics and laugh at them because they seem so ridiculous. But it's very difficult for us for some reason to learn from history in that sense and apply that to today's media and avoid blaming fictional media for what might be perfectly legitimate social concerns, that we have. But we'll see. Maybe the half-life of these things will become shorter as people get a little bit more aware.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're pretty much out of time. I think that's a good note to end on. Do you have any just final thoughts or any other projects you want to let people know about?
Yeah, I mean, if people want to, read some of my short stories, they can go to my website, which is ChristopherJFerguson.com. I wasn't too imaginative about that. And there are links to my books and stuff there. I mean, I'm still working, of course, on a lot of research on media effects. I think we're kind of coming towards I don't know how many more studies of violent video games we need. I think we kind of got it at this point. But obviously, as new concerns pop up, I've done a little bit of work with 13 Reasons Why. Coming from some of the panics about 13 Reasons Why. Doing a little bit with Dungeons and Dragons more recently, and a few other things as well. So it's really I kind of keep my head down to the ground to try to hear the rumbles of what people are concerned about. And I think those are always kind of interesting to test. I mean, like I said, occasionally one will pop up there actually is something to it, like advertising effects actually do seem to have some impact. But in most of these situations, it actually is quite difficult to find evidence for people's fears of media effects.
All right, cool. Yes, we're going to wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with Christopher J. Ferguson about his books Moral Combat and How Madness Shaped History. So Chris, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it was really awesome being on. Thank you.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Christopher J. Ferguson for joining us on the show. And remember that Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoyed the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.